Well, I'm still sitting here waiting desperately for Ashes and Malifaux to drop. And one of the only things that eases the pain and suffering during this difficult time for all of us is talking about what we think might be coming in the book. So if you haven't caught them yet, then check out the video that I did talking about stuff that could be coming over from Through the Breach, as well as stuff that could be coming from the general lore. I also recently did a breakdown of all the stuff that got added to the upcoming page for the first few months of 2024. And you'll notice that a lot of that stuff comes from other sources and things that we've already seen in the game. So there's definitely reason to think that some of this stuff could actually be coming to the game at some point. But now, instead of going back over any of those two subjects, what I'm going to do this time is take a look at some of the art that has been in previous books and talk about the ways that they could be repurposed and added to the game. If you've had a flip through any of the Malifaux rulebooks, then you will notice that occasionally there will be some art for characters or other things that are just kind of one-off pieces and never get used again. And then every once in a while, one of them will sneak into the game. Well, I was recently going through some of the art, and I was kind of surprised to find how many different pieces they've done over the years, and they've never used them again. A lot of this stuff comes from Through the Breach, but it also comes out of Penny Dreadfuls, Wyrd Chronicles, and even the mainline rulebooks. So I'm going to pick out 10 of my favorites, and we're going to talk about the ways that we might see them come into the game in Ashes or something in the future. But as always, the whole point of this is to have the conversation, so if you have a theory about some old art that you really like, then drop it in the comments below. And if you have a different idea about any of the choices that I picked, then let me know what you think as well. But let's get right to it. Now, if you played Through the Breach, then you probably know that the magic system in that game is really expansive, and it's super customizable with all different kinds of magic and tweaks that you can do to that magic to give it different characteristics. And one of the most interesting parts about that is that you can actually summon a Gaiman with any of the elemental immunos that are available in the game, and there's many. So in addition to the fire, ice, metal, poison, and wind Gaiman that we already know about in Malifaux, you can make a darkness, a light, a natural, or a terror Gaiman. Now, there's a lot of different options to choose from, and I'm not saying that every one of these needs to come over to Malifaux, because I think Sandeep's keyword's probably big enough already as it is. But I think we definitely need to get a couple more of them in there, because Gaiman and Golem are really cool, and I think having different options for the different elements would be really awesome. Now, to that point, we've actually already seen art for Electric Gaiman and an Electric Golem, and they come out of the Penny Dreadful, the Bayou games. Now, these guys are pretty cool looking, and just like all the rest of the elemental stuff, they have special characteristics based on the type of element that they're associated with. Electricity's big thing in Through the Breach is that it ignores armor. So very likely if these came over the game, they would be similar to the other Gaiman, but they would have attacks that ignore armor, instead of doing burning or giving slow like we see on the other ones. Now, the interesting question here would be what crews this would work the best in. And I think the first obvious choice is going to be Sandeep, because he's the master of all the Gaiman. And I think having another elemental Gaiman in there makes a lot of sense. Again, his keyword is a little bit crowded, and I'm not sure if all the Gaiman are going to see a ton of play if they add more, but the only Gaiman that are in the game that are not part of his crew already are the Whiskey Gaiman and the Soulstone Gaiman, and I think there's good reasons for both of those things. But then there's always the option of them being dual keyword with another crew, so I think there's a couple of interesting choices here. The first and most obvious would be Ramos or Hoffman. I think thematically they make a ton of sense to have worked with Ramos, but obviously he's Dead Man's Hand, and he's probably not going to get more stuff added to his keyword now. But maybe down the road if he ever comes back. I think it makes sense at least thematically for Hoffman, but I'm not sure if it makes a ton of sense from a story perspective, because Hoffman's thing is that he controls constructs with his mind. He's not necessarily like manipulating electricity in any particular way that I think would allow him to control an electric Gaiman, but I don't think it'd be much of a stretch for them to go that direction. The more interesting choice, in my opinion, would be to have them work in Zip's crew. Now, there's two reasons for that. One, obviously he wields an electric gun, so having it, for some reason, produce electric Gaiman, I think, isn't too much of a stretch. I also really like the idea of him flying around in his airship and throwing electric Gaiman down at people, because it's funny to me. But the other important point is that these actually come from the Bayou Games Penny Dreadful, and in that adventure, without spoiling too much, there's a machine that basically functions like a battery that was invented by someone working for the Union, and it gets lost in the bayou. Now, because of shenanigans, this contraption is what eventually creates the electric Gaiman. But I think it would be really fun if either that ends up in Zip's hands, or it ends up in the hands of some gremlins who work for Zip and maybe they make a copy of it, or they try to modify it in some way, and eventually they develop the ability to produce the Gaiman. It's a little bit of a stretch, but I think it fits in really well with the Bayou, and especially Zip and his crazy antics. So, plus it would be an interesting way to see a crossover between two different factions and two different crews that we don't really see associated with each other very much. Now, this art's actually popped up in a couple of different places, and in some cases it's actually been palette swapped to look like a darker version of itself. And we know that Darkness Gaiman are a thing, at least in the story, but I would hope that if they bring both to the game, they would have some new art made up so that they look a little bit different. Now, this right here is a piece of art that I'm sure most of you have seen before. And maybe you're not exactly sure where you've seen it before, but let me give you a little hint. So this is the picture that's actually behind Titania on the cover of the Ripples of Fate book. And as far as we can tell, this is supposed to be a picture of Nythera when Titania is actually escaping during the events of that book. But the interesting thing that you may not have noticed, and it's a little bit more obvious when you look at the art without Titania on top of it, is all these little dudes that are climbing out of the hole. Now, according to the story of what happened, Titania was entombed with a whole bunch of the Autumn Court, who were sort of her followers, and the people kind of feared them just like they feared Titania, so they decided to throw them away along with her. And interestingly, because they were so close to her, they were also affected by the Grave Spirit's power, and they kind of lost their eyes and turned all like creepy zombie looking. But you might have noticed that we already have Autumn Night models in the game. They used to have specific names like the Thorn and all that, but now they're just Autumn Knights, and they don't really look anything like these things. So then the question becomes, why are these different from the Autumn Knights? They look a little bit more like Titania herself. They're kind of pale humanoid things with strange designs on their bodies, whereas the Autumn Knights kind of look like forest creatures. They have like plants growing on them and bark armor and all this weird stuff. Now, maybe this is what they look like underneath all that stuff, or maybe this is what they look like because they were laying in the tomb for so long, and once they kind of regenerate and reacquire their power, they look more like the Autumn Knights we're familiar with. I don't think that would be too much of a stretch, because we do know that the area around Nythera was kind of a barren desert until Titania came back, and then basically a forest popped up and started growing from there. That's kind of her thing. She manipulates nature and stuff like that. But either way, I think it would be pretty cool to learn more about the Autumn Court, and maybe get some more models that represent different characters from the court. Maybe they would look like these, or maybe there's a good reason why they wouldn't. But either way, I want an explanation. Now, another interesting tidbit here is that we've also seen another piece of art for an Autumn Knight that was in another Penny Dreadful that doesn't look like the ones that we already have. This is from the Jurassic Foe Penny Dreadful one-shot, and obviously it looks much more similar to the Autumn Knights that we're familiar with, but it's a different version altogether. So maybe one day we'll see the Autumn Knights that we have now turn back into specific named characters, and then we'll get a generic version of them that'll look like this. Or maybe we'll see some other models come out that are part of the Autumn Court and maybe have a different job or a different station. I think it's reasonable to assume that there would be some variety among the court. Not everybody would be so similar that they could use the same stat sheet. So potentially we would see a stronger or a weaker version of them, or maybe one that has a different role altogether. Now, this one's a little bit more abstract, but it's interesting to me because we actually get this art from one of the main rulebooks. This one shows up in the Shifting Loyalties book, and he's just kind of a creepy-looking necromancer holding a staff. But I find it interesting because this doesn't seem like it's just like a generic piece of art of a dude. It looks like it has enough character and personality that maybe at one point it was intended to become a model or a character in the game in some way. But it's just kind of sitting there in the rulebook and hasn't been used. I think it might have popped up elsewhere at a certain point, but I think it would be cool if we saw this guy come to the game. I feel like at this point the Resurrectionists are a little bit short on interesting personalities in the faction. A lot of the other factions have been getting a lot of new characters and people that are kind of potentially going to interact with the story in really serious ways in the future, but I think the Resurrectionists are a little bit lacking in that department. Part of that is because a lot of the main Resurrectionists have already had their own sort of full story arcs, and of course there's always potential that we're going to see some new stories popping up with them, but right now there's not a whole lot going on. So having some new characters added to the faction, even if they're not master level, they could be henchmen or enforcers, I think it could be pretty interesting, and there's definitely a lot of stories left related to the Resurrectionists for them to tell. So maybe this guy could come into the game as a henchman that works with 2 different keywords, or he could potentially come to the game as a versatile so he can work with everybody. For some reason, he also gives me kind of Hamlin vibes. I'm not exactly sure why that is. It could just be the tattered clothes and the evil look in his eyes, but it could be kind of interesting to see him be dual keyword between another Resurrectionist and Hamlin's keyword. That would be kind of interesting because originally when the Piper's Plague broke out, there was rumors that they were led by Resurrectionists, and that was actually why Lady Justice got sent to track down Hamlin in the big story that kind of ended in Nicodem's Observatory when the event happened. So it would be kind of cool to get a little reference to the sort of resurrectionist-y look to some of his followers. Obviously, Hamlin deals a lot with like decay and bugs and these kids that are stolen, and they would all kind of fit reasonably well, I think, in a resurrectionist-style crew. So maybe this guy could do something with spreading plague and also interact in some ways with some of the undead. Maybe he summons some mindless zombies or he buffs them in some way. Interestingly, because of what I was saying before about there not being a ton of characters that are prominent in the Resurrectionists right now, there's actually kind of a lot of art in the Through the Breach books for necromancers of different kinds, and most of that art has never been used. So maybe he comes to the game with a whole team of other minor necromancers who sort of come to prominence in some way, and maybe they work together and cooperate. We actually do know that not long before he died, Nicodem had actually killed off a whole bunch of other minor necromancers so that he could take their undead and kind of add them to his army. So maybe now with him gone, we start seeing more of these lower powered and kind of less important necromancers popping up and joining up with other crews. Or going off and doing their own thing, either way. Now, we all know that kids are horrifying, and that's especially true when it comes to Malifaux. We already have a pretty good selection of child models that are scary and terrifying and do bad things in the game. But this is actually something that used to come up in the lore a lot more often. There's been lots of references to child gangs and sort of street kids who do crime in order to survive. And the homelessness problem is a huge issue in Malifaux, especially with orphan kids, which is sort of why they get pushed into these types of lifestyles. And throughout the years, we've gotten a whole bunch of different art for kids, some of which just look like normal kids. Some of them look a little bit more like they might be part of a gang or something like that. And most of them have never shown up in the game. So these kids, for example, come from the Knight in Rottenburg Penny Dreadful. But this art has shown up in a couple of different places, and there's a whole bunch of other kids that we've seen in different rulebooks, different Penny Dreadfuls, as well as Wyrd Chronicles. Now, I think there's a whole bunch of different crews in the game that these kids could be added to, and it would make a lot of sense. But I think it would be even more interesting if we got a new keyword that was sort of one of these miniature minor keywords that we've seen, where they're kind of not associated with a master, but there's a handful of models in one faction that work with that keyword. And in this case, it could be like a teenage gang. We've gotten a handful of gangs named in the lore, including like the wee Malkies who have showed up in a few different places. And a lot of times they take on roles of like information brokers and spies because they're small and unassuming and they can kind of listen in on conversations without being noticed. But in a lot of cases, they're also really violent and they'll beat people up if they need to. So I'm thinking like maybe a new box for Outcasts, being that their starter box was sort of part of Explorer Society more so than it was Outcasts. And it could be a bunch of sort of teenagers who do different roles within this gang. And maybe they sell their services to different organizations when they're needed. Now, I'm not a big fan of child soldiers, and I don't think that's something that should be promoted, but it is a reality of the world of Malifaux, and I think it shows sort of the darker corner of normal everyday life, and it could be kind of interesting to see that represented in the game a little bit more. So this is probably the weirdest piece of art on this whole list, and I'm guessing that most of you have never seen this before. So this weird ant creature robot showed up in the first rulebook for Malifaux First Edition. And it's super weird. We never really see anything like this. It's kind of in the style of what a lot of the constructs look like in First Edition, but it's obviously very different from any of the constructs that we've gotten. I'm thinking at one point maybe it was intended to represent like a mining construct that would go down with the workers in the Union and dig out some of the tunnels. It's got that headlamp on that kind of gives me that vibe, but I'm not sure that this thing looks like it's particularly well equipped to dig. It's got these like sharp incisors on the front, but those don't look like they'd be great for moving rocks. It looks like it would be better at fighting, really. It also looks like somebody tagged it up a little bit, which is kind of interesting because it kind of indicates that this thing works closely with humans in some way. So I could definitely see this kind of joining up with a rail crew or maybe a mining crew and being part of the Arcanists, maybe in Foundry or MNSU. And then, of course, there's the obvious choice that it could work with Hoffman. I don't see this as being a guild construct because they tend to be a little bit more militant looking and kind of shiny and more well polished. This thing looks a little bit more dirty and grungy, and it kind of gives me more MNSU vibes for sure. It's really weird, and honestly, I don't think we'd ever see something like this come to the game. It's been way too long, but it would be really cool. It would be a super interesting little Easter egg if they were to bring it to the game, because it came from book 1 from how many years ago at this point. Or maybe at some point it'll just pop up as a strange reference in a Through the Breach adventure. Although I do think it would make a pretty cool model. It's very interesting looking. Now, if you're watching this video, then you've probably wondered many times why more people don't play Malifaux. And one of the ways that we can try to fix that problem is by getting Malifaux stuff in front of more people. So on that note, do me a huge favor and let the YouTube algorithm know that you like this video by hitting the like button, making sure that you're subscribed to the channel, and sharing the video with your local Discord community, your Facebook group, whatever your gaming group of choice might be. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but the more that you do that, the more that YouTube tries to push this video out to the wider gaming community, and the more people get their eyes on it, which both helps me grow the channel and it helps to grow the wider Malifaux community, which is always a good thing. Now, if you want to support the channel more directly, you can check out the links in the description, including the Wyrd affiliate link where you can shop on their website and it supports the channel with a kickback for every purchase that you make. The merch store where you can get Defective Dice merchandise, as well as the Patreon. There's been a whole bunch of different polls that have been going up on Patreon about content that's coming up and the direction that the channel is going to go in, so check those out if you're interested. And you can also get a whole bunch of other stuff like priority access to our Through the Breach games, ad-free versions of the videos, discounts on the merch store, and all kinds of other stuff. But with that, let's get right back into the video. Now, I could certainly do an entire video like this, maybe 2 videos like this, just using the art for the pursuits from Through the Breach. There's dozens of pursuits, and almost every single one of them has a unique piece of art that is used to represent that pursuit in the game. And the vast majority of them are unique pieces of art that are not used elsewhere. Interestingly, you might have noticed that the Ghost Eater that was recently shown off on the upcoming page on Wyrd's website is actually art that was originally from the Ghost Eater pursuit in Through the Breach. But I wanted to make sure that I showed off some of the other interesting bits from Wyrd through the years, so we're not going to do the video just about those. But this was way too interesting to pass up. So this is the Monster Hunter Pursuit from the From Nightmares Through the Breach expansion, which is the Neverborn focus book. And along with this art, we also get a little explanation of the fact that a lot of the Neverborn have infighting going on between the different races. And it's not necessarily unheard of for a Woe or a Mimic to fight against a Nephilim, for example. Now, in this case, we also see that they might even sign up to be a Neverborn hunter and get paid for hunting their kin, which is kind of disturbing in some ways, but it's definitely interesting to see that interplay between the Neverborn and the humans where they might actually benefit from interacting in a more peaceful way. Now, I really like this art because it shows what clearly looks like some sort of Mimic that is dressed up to look a lot like the Ortegas and clearly just took down a big Nephilim. So how cool would it be to get a dual keyword family and Mimic model? Obviously, it would have to be a Mimic that was disguising itself a little bit better than this as a member of the family, because I'm pretty sure that Perdita and the rest of them would just kill a Mimic on sight if they met one. On the other hand, maybe it was so good at hunting Nephilim that they just accepted it as a member of their own because the enemy of my enemy and all that. I don't know, I see a lot of potential there for some really interesting stories, and I think it would be really interesting in the game to see something that crosses over between those two keywords because they have very different play styles. But really, I just think this art is really sick, and it's probably one of my favorites on this list, so it would be really cool to see it turn into an official model and come into the game. I don't typically play Guild, but if I was going to play Guild, it would probably be Perdita and the family, and it would be kind of awesome to see a Mimic get added into that crew. It would certainly be much different from anything else that we've seen in there. Now, this one is really interesting to me because it's a full piece of art as opposed to just a sort of character model. And this actually comes from the From Shadows Through the Breach expansion, which is the 10 Thunders focus book. We've obviously seen a handful of models that have this sort of color palette to them. The thing that Yasunori is riding has this sort of blue rainbow color scheme to it. And so do the Quillin, which are Kimon that have shown up in the other side, as well as Through the Breach. But this thing's really weird because it's obviously a little bit different from both of those things. It almost looks like a cross between a peacock and a phoenix. Generally, when we see this color scheme, we don't see it looking like actual flame when it gets to the kind of red or orange color. But here it definitely looks like those are supposed to be flames. Now, interestingly, we've also seen some art for a phoenix-like creature called the Suzaku in Through the Breach. And it probably also has a connection to the Kimon based on the Through the Breach adventure that it comes from. But it looks much more like a traditional phoenix. It doesn't have this sort of vibrant blue color to it. So this thing is kind of like a combination between 3 or 4 different things that we've seen before, and I'm really curious what it's supposed to be. Now, it's pretty likely that this thing comes from some sort of legend or myth from Eastern mythology. So if you're aware of some sort of peacock, phoenix, colorful bird from any mythology, then drop a comment below and let me know because I'll be super curious to learn about it. But it's a really striking piece of art, and I think it would make a really cool model to come to any of the games, really. So the Gremlins are obviously known for a handful of things. Horrible violence, eating pigs, wearing big hats, drinking shine. That's probably like the top 4. But what we don't see quite as much of in the games is a little bit more about their kind of more mundane parts of their culture. And we obviously know that most of their culture comes from just copying and imitating humans that they've observed. So it kind of makes sense that they would have some sort of musical tradition. Plus, based on the real-life human cultures that this comes from, it kind of makes sense that there would be a lot of like folk music coming from places in the bayou. Now, we've definitely seen gremlins playing instruments before in different models, but we've never seen the cello gremlin before, and I think this would make for a really cool model. I think it's a little bit of a missed opportunity for this to have been in the Crossroads 7, but there could certainly be like a smaller sub-faction of gremlins in the bayou that are all music-based. I don't know if this is a cello or an upright bass, but I'm sure somebody that's listening to this can tell me, so let us know. Now, this model is especially fun because he's also got like a banjo on his back, and it looks like he's standing on a drum. Maybe? It could just be a barrel, but it's more fun if it's a drum. And how cool would it be if we got a box full of gremlins, one that was playing the drums, one that was playing the banjo, one that looks like this, and maybe a couple that are like square dancing or something like that. Honestly, I'll take anything at this point that gives us a little bit more lore or background to the gremlins, because they're really underrepresented in the narrative. And maybe one day we'll even get a story that goes along with it where they're kind of touring around the bayou and maybe they even head to Edgepoint and perform for some humans and see how that goes. I'm sure it'll be fine. There'll be no problems at all. Nothing bad will happen. If you're a fan of the Gremlins and you weren't playing the game during first edition, then I highly recommend that you go back and look at some of the old Gremlin art. All of the first edition art was a lot more stylized and kind of strange than a lot of the stuff that we see nowadays, but in particular, the Gremlins were really weird looking, and I kind of love it. And I feel like very few pieces of art show that off better than the typewriter Gremlin here. So this guy actually comes from Wyrd Chronicles, which was the magazine that Wyrd used to put out with a whole bunch of different kinds of content in it. But one of the things that they did in a few of the early editions was a column called Ask a Gremlin, which was basically like user-submitted questions that they answered in the magazine. And this guy was basically a little mascot that sat there and typed out the answers. This is a really fun piece of art, and I immediately start thinking about a gremlin that works for the Tattler under Nelly and reports on things that are going on in the bayou. And that's probably a little far-fetched because of the guild's attitude towards the bayou, but I feel like, especially pre-Burning Man, Nelly might have set something like that up just to make sure she kept an eye on what was going on in the bayou in case there was any important stories that she needed to report, even if she wasn't supposed to officially have any contact with gremlins or she was supposed to kill them and collect the bounty. So maybe this guy's like big hat and journalist, and he works for Nelly as a spy, kind of keeping tabs on the Joneses and all the different sort of infighting and problems that are going on in the bayou at all times. I don't know what kind of mechanics that would come with to cross over between those two crews, but it would be really interesting to see Wyrd take a crack at it. And as always, anything that gives us a sort of crossover between the gremlins and the humans, I'm always on board for that. I want to see more stories where they interact with each other and we don't just fight and kill each other. Now, this is kind of a strange one for me because this kind of feels to me like some of the older art style, but we actually see this piece of art show up in the From Nightmares Through the Breach expansion for Neverborn. And this makes me wonder because obviously this is some sort of maybe mimic or doppelganger that can transform its appearance, but its true form is shown in the reflection in the mirror. But we've never seen a Neverborn that really looks like this. Now, obviously, the twisting did a lot of strange things to the Neverborn, and it's certainly not impossible that there's lots of different kinds of Neverborn that we've never seen before. They could be hiding out in the forest, or they could have went to a different part of Malifaux that we've never been to. But it's also kind of interesting to see it disguising itself as a sort of like member of high society like this. We don't really see a lot of that in the game, and I think it would be really interesting to see a model that could transform itself between this sort of more natural kind of monster-looking form into a normal-looking person. It could make an interesting dual keyword with something like Performer, or pretty much any crew in Explorer Society, being that most of them are kind of these like rich high society people. Now, this comes from the Neverborn book, so this is a little bit more unlikely, but this creature to me kind of looks a little bit more Cadmus-y than it looks like a Nephilim. So the other option would be that maybe this is a non-sentient creature that has the ability to transform in some ways, but it was infested by the Cadmus parasite and then it had developed the ability to turn into a human. Maybe with the hive mind intelligence, it can kind of disguise itself as a person better, whereas the more primitive creature that it's inhabiting wouldn't normally have been able to do that convincingly. That would still obviously make that creature technically Neverborn if it's native to Malifaux, but maybe it doesn't necessarily go with one of the Neverborn keywords. It could just be dual keyword Cadmus and Performer, or maybe it can disguise itself in kind of pretty much any other crew that it wants to. We've been seeing more of these sort of transforming models to the game, and I think this would be a kind of unique and interesting dynamic for a model that can transform in a little bit more of an unexpected way. So that's 10 different pieces of art that Wyrd has used but have never come to the game that I think could be interesting additions to the game in the future. But I actually have one last bonus piece of art for you to check out because I have a really important question. What did this chicken do to get himself put in shackles like this? I need to know all of your theories, so drop a comment below and let me know about the chicken crimes. It's maybe the most important question with the new book coming out, and we need answers. If I don't get a story about the chicken crimes, I'm going to be super upset. But I probably won't, so I'm going to console myself by reading all of your ideas. So make sure you get down there and let me know, and don't forget to check out the other videos that I did speculating about things that could be coming to Ashes of Malifaux, plus the video I did breaking down the stuff that got added to the upcoming recently. It's all really exciting. It's all everybody's talking about. I'm excited. I hope you are too. Stay tuned because we got a lot of really cool stuff coming up in the future, and I want to send a huge thank you to the Extremely Cool Kids tier on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatize, and Devin. And thanks for watching.